So a few months ago, I made a video talking about the wildest Nazgul backstories from MERP, Middle-earth roleplaying. It was a lot of fun, especially when you get to talk about a Nazgul who replaced his eyes with magic gems to get magical powers and then married his sister, or another that survived a plague, went insane, and believed he was the son of a volcano. Perfect. But funnily enough, this stuff almost pales in comparison to what we're talking about today. In this video, let's talk about the Court of Ardor, the most insane Middle-earth fanfiction. Now you might be thinking, nah, I've read some pretty insane fanfiction, I'm sure this isn't that crazy. And to be fair, if you've been on AO3 or Wattpad or fanfiction.net, you might have seen some wild stories. I'm talking about the self-insert character that falls in love with Aragorn or Legolas, or maybe even Aragorn and Legolas falling in love with each other. But on this channel, we don't shit on fanfiction written by 15-year-old girls, because I was that person. Well, I wasn't a 15-year-old girl, nor did I write self-inserts or love stories, but I did write some shitty fanfiction. One of them followed a soldier during the Fall of Arnor, and during that story, the characters frequently use the word guys. I really love when Gandalf the White revealed himself to the Three Hunters by saying, "Hey guys." No, the difference here is that the Court of Ardor was an officially licensed role-playing campaign book published by Iron Crown Enterprises in 1982 and written by Terry K. Amthor, who wrote a whole bunch of MERP modules. Fun fact, Terry was only 24 when he wrote this module, so he wasn't exactly a veteran writer. Not so fun fact, Terry's been dead for a few years, so RIP Terry. So yeah, even though I'll be poking fun at the Court of Ardor, it's in good faith, no malice intended. Okay, so the Court of Ardor is set in the far south of Middle-earth, in the southern reaches of Harad, in a jungle region called Mumakan, which you may have heard of if you're familiar with MERP or have played the Realms in Exile mod for Crusader Kings 3. Okay, now that we have the place, let's ask, what actually is the Court of Ardor? Well, the origin of the Court of Ardor is with the rising of the sun and moon. This happens a few years after Morgoth destroys the two trees, and upon seeing these new creations, Morgoth is pissed. He hates the sun and moon, especially because they weaken his creatures. He actually sends shadow spirits up to attack Tilion, the Maya who guides the moon, but these attempts are unsuccessful. He doesn't try the same with Arian, the Maya who guides the sun, because he's much more afraid of her power. In the end, Morgoth can't really do much about the sun and moon other than to mitigate their effects. This is why he creates Fangorodrim and why it's always belching out black fumes, to block out the sun and the moon, and to protect his creatures from their light. The Court of Ardor builds on this idea. So far it's lore accurate, except it goes completely insane straight away. Morgoth continues his project to destroy the sun and moon, and for this, he enlists the aid of Ardana the Astrologer, a mighty Noldoran elf who is obsessed with the stars, and is also of the opinion that the sun and moon must be destroyed, because I guess they obscure the stars. Like, I don't know, why don't you just wait until nightfall? She travels around, brainwashing other elves to her cause, or even just finding ones that are straight up evil, like way worse than the Sons of Feanor ever were. Some of them are actually just comically evil. Anyway, her and her merry band make their way to Mumakan, where they get to work on destroying the sun and moon, which I'll talk about soon, but first, let's introduce the Court of Ardor. Okay, so the Court of Ardor is made up of 12 lords, but in reality there's way more members who more or less functioned like the Illuminati of Mumakan and the Southern Lands, although they did have their own powerful fortresses and followers. So I'll talk about some of the members, others I'll just sort of list off because they're really not that interesting. From what I understand, the leader is Ardana. She's the fanatic who wants to destroy the sun and moon, but funnily enough, there isn't actually that much else about her. Guess she's kind of boring. The other co-leader, I think, is a guy called Mojtaba. He's also a Noldoran elf, he's described as a coward, and he has a bowl cut, which is how you know this was written in the 80s. Another big player is Valmorgul, another Noldo who is also a massive psychopath, like he will lose his temper and just kill anyone around him. He's also known as the Magician because he shapeshifts and pretends to be an advisor to the Emperor of Tantarak, a Numenorian colony and later Mannish kingdom. Funnily enough, he loses his arm in a fight and then gets a red artificial arm made of something called Leone, some kind of metal I think, and that gives him more powers. If you're familiar with Cyberpunk, Val Morgul is kind of just Adam Smasher. Perhaps the funniest member is a guy named Morphuin, who is literally just a demon. He has a human form where he's a bald guy with red skin. I'm not even making this up. His demon form is more or less similar to a Balrog, but he's never actually described as a Balrog. He's literally just called a demon, as if this is Dungeons and Dragons. He's also described as simple of mind. He's also actually not the only demon. There's another guy called Leshai who also has red skin, but he seems to only be partially demon, so I guess a demon slept with someone at some point. There's Gorthaur. If you recognize that name, it's because it's one of Sauron's names. But this guy isn't Sauron. We're not exactly sure what he is, except he's described as the High Priest, and that in his spare time, just for fun, he likes to assume the form of Amaru, who the Haradrim of Mumakan worship as a god. So yeah, this guy's literally just a massive troll. And trust me, the insanity is not over. Our next member is Cambragol, or Carol Decdarion. Don't ask me about the names. He's actually a member of the House of Finrod, not sure what the relation is. He's known as the Monk for some reason, and it has nothing to do with his personality because he's also described as a massive psychopath. The last members I'll talk about in full are the Feature. The Feature are actually twins, both with the name Feature for some reason, and they look almost identical except they're not, because one is male and one is female. Both were seduced by Morgoth in their youth, but male Feature eventually realized that, hey, we're the bad guys, so he just gave up on living, but the Vala sent him back as their own agent, so he's the Vala's inside man in the Court of Ardor. The female one, however, remained evil and had no idea about the betrayal of the male one. I'll just list off the others now. There's Towerclax, a Sindarin scholar who was a spy reporting directly to Morgoth. There's Kelakar, an elf who was also a seer, and he's basically Towerclax's best friend. There's Camring, a Noldo healer who hates murder and often wonders why he's even part of the Court of Ardor. Definition of fell in with the wrong crowd there. There's Valkrist, a Sindar who is described as massive and the best warrior in the court, although he's not described as a psycho. There's Sulharok, a Sindar who is basically just a glorified messenger. There's Vesuvius, a Noldo who is described as Cambragol's lieutenant. There's Arduval, a Noldo whose whole thing is that he's charming. There's Rilia, a Noldo who is obsessed with knowledge and gets blamed for war crimes, although she wasn't responsible. There's Linsul, a seductive bard, not sure whether she's a Noldo or Sindar. There's Valglin, a Sylvan elf whose whole thing is just being a thief, which I find hilarious. The court has one Sylvan elf and she's a kleptomaniac. And finally, there's Yavakamba, a Noldo who is a surgeon and is loyal to male Feature. There's also Dave, a Sindar who is the court's garbage man, Greg who works as the court's chef, and there's Darren who's the court's resident crackhead. Okay, that was a lie, I made Dave and Greg up. Now, the court doesn't just get to operate without opposition. There's a few groups that were opposed to them. There's the Tai Arana, which I think are a trio of siblings who were local elven lords, and there's the Guild of Elements, very Tolkien-esque. But keep in mind, this was written in 1982, so I wouldn't say it's unoriginal. These two groups actually did stop the Court of Ardor during the First Age, at great loss to themselves, and the court went underground. Eventually, the Guild of Elements just ended up being the main opposition to the court. They were made up of 5 elves, including one of the original 3 of the Tai Arana, Lyrin, an elf named Clein, who was Gorthaur's bastard son, the male Feature, and then there's 2 others, Laure Menelrana, a Noldo, and Rana, a Sindar. Okay, so at this point, I'm just saying random names, so that's enough with that. The Court of Ardor wants to destroy the Sun and Moon. But how do they want to achieve this? Well, fortunately, there's a way. When Ungoliant consumed Feanor's gems, she belched some of them forth, but now these gems were corrupted with Unlight, which I guess means they have the ability to consume light. Morgoth gives 8 of these gems to the court and tasks them to build the device that would allow them to focus their energy upon the Sun and Moon, consuming their light. But there's one problem. You need to sacrifice someone with the blood of the Vala to trigger the gems. This is a problem because Morgoth isn't going to sacrifice himself, but Ardana has an idea. She will bear Morgoth's child, and they will sacrifice them instead. This happens towards the end of the First Age. Ardana gives birth to Morgoth's children, although the word fathered is in quotation marks in the module, so who knows what actually happened there. But there's twins, a girl named Moralen and a boy named Moran, not Moron, Muran. Moralen is healthy, but Moran appears to be dead, but plot twist, he's actually alive. Yavakamba takes the boy to male Feature, who remember is a traitor to the court, and he raises the boy instead. Funnily enough, at their birth, a guy named Mothrog, who is meant to be Morgoth's seer, hears a prophecy in a dream that basically says that the boy is going to end up killing his mum, but the prophecy confuses him and he decides not to bother Morgoth with it. The guy literally had one job and failed at it because he's too stupid to realize that you're not going to understand prophecies unless you have context, so maybe you should try and find it. But unfortunately for the court, when they're about to conduct the ritual a few decades later, male Feature betrays them, Moralen goes missing, and their enemies launch an attack on the court. It's costly, but they do succeed in stopping the ritual and stealing 3 of the gems. Without the 8 gems, the court can't make the sun and moon go boom. A few years later, Morgoth is defeated anyway, and the court goes into hiding. They return in the Second Age, never quite returning to their original power, partially because they have a fairly tense relationship with Sauron. Alright, so what happens to the Court of Ardor in the end? Well, they do succeed in retrieving 2 of the 3 missing gems, but it doesn't matter in the end. Sometime between 1700 and 3000 of the Third Age, the court is pretty much annihilated. Ardana, Gorthaur, Val Morgul, Valchrist, Morfuin, Rilia, and the female Feature are all described as being killed. Only Kellikar, Towerclax, Cambragol, and Arduval are described as surviving, the former 2 because they were secretly aligned with Sauron. Kellikar also assumes the role of the Magician of Tantarak, disguising himself as Val Morgul because he's dead. There's 2 ways this happens. One is the classic role-playing method of a party getting together and destroying the court, with the help of the Guild of Elements and Moran, Morgoth's son. This should be fairly easy because if you're following the lore as well as the module does, you can probably argue with the Dungeon Master that your group should have access to an Abrams tank and an Apache helicopter. If the group fails, then Sauron succeeds anyway, most likely by sending his Nazgul. He views the court as a liability, and he doesn't really gain much if they succeed. He doesn't really care for the sun and moon to be destroyed, and he's worried that if they succeed, they will become more powerful than him, possibly because they will release Morgoth from the void, and Sauron is pretty happy with being a god of his own by this point. Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. How accurate is the Court of Ardor? Well, like I said at the start of the video, the premise is based on actual lore. Morgoth did attempt an attack on the moon, but yeah, that's pretty much where any accuracy ends. Beyond that, Court of Ardor is basically just Shadow of War tier nonsense. Actually, it's probably worse than Shadow of War because Shadow of War still feels Tolkien-esque at times. And that's the biggest problem with the Court of Ardor. Beyond the inaccuracies, it also just doesn't feel like Tolkien. Let's talk about the contradictions first. Take the court itself, which is largely made up of elves, and while Tolkien did write that elves could do bad things, he also wrote that they never willingly served Morgoth. Not only does the Court of Ardor gladly serve Morgoth, but they're absolute psychopaths while doing so. You have some members who are just the I'm just following orders war crime committed types, which is still bad, but you also have some who are outright malevolent. They're cruel and brutal for no reason other than their own entertainment. Some of the extended lore in the book also talks about the men who are native to the area, such as the Karani and the Hathorians. The information about their culture and origins is decent enough, but at the end, we're told that the Karani can live up to 200 years, and the Hathorians can live as long as 150. On top of that, the Karani also have the ability to relinquish their lives. But Tolkien tells us that the long lifespans and the ability to choose your time of death was a gift exclusive to the Númenóreans because of how the Edain fought against Morgoth. But in the Court of Ardor, this concept is essentially watered down because now other men have the exact same gifts. But the inaccuracies aren't really the problem, because the Court of Ardor, a made-up organization filled with made-up characters, is set in Mumacan, a made-up place. That's fine. But if you look at Lotro, it makes up a lot of stuff, but ultimately most of it feels Tolkien-esque, whereas the Court of Ardor utterly fails. It instead feels like generic fantasy. You have Morgoth fathering children in order to sacrifice them to unlock the power of gems that will consume the light of the sun and moon. You have artifacts like Ardana's deck of magical tarot cards. Yes, I didn't even mention them. You have random demons like Morphuin and Leshai, whose exact nature is never explained. Valmorgul has an artificial arm and he's the magician of Tantarak. You have names that feel utterly out of place, like Towerclax or Carol Dicdarion or Pesuvius. That goes for the organizations as well. There's the Guild of Elements, the Starseer Conclave, the Sisters of the Mind. You have elves like the Tai Arana who were so powerful that when they died, they could just will themselves back to life. Like I said, all of this stuff is completely fine for other fantasy settings, but it just doesn't really feel like Tolkien. It feels like you could take the Court of Ardor, change a couple of names, and transplant it into any other high fantasy setting. And Pete Fenlon, the creator of MERP, did say that the Court of Ardor was renegade and rather bizarre, and in a module called The Shadow of the South, released in 1988, he did add some more information which made the Southern Lands come across a lot more grounded. But a full revision of Court of Ardor was never completed. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you've played a game using the Court of Ardor module, please do comment and tell us how it went. I'd love to see what you and your friends came up with. As for other MERP stuff, please do suggest other interesting things to talk about, because while I was somewhat familiar with Be'lakor and Court of Ardor, there's like dozens of other modules that I haven't read. Let me know if they're worth checking out. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Carol Dicdarion, what a guy.